Hi guys, welcome to the third tutorial on creating ALV tables in Webdynpro for ABAP. In this tutorial we will look at how to add self-defined functions to the toolbar of the ALV table. If you want to add, for example, an input element in the toolbar, or you want to add a custom button here and you want to trigger some action once we click that button. We'll see how to do that in this tutorial. Okay, so before we do that, I will show you what is the configuration. There's a class given by SAP, which has all the methods that we require to configure the ALV table in Webdynpro for ABAP. Just a minute. Yeah, this one. CL WD config table. So this class will have all the methods that we use in configuring the ALV table. Okay. So what we need to do, before we start configuring, we need to get the reference of this model. Okay, so how to do that? You can use the code wizard. Go to the code wizard and say, um, first we need to instantiate the used component like we did in the last tutorial. So because we're doing that in the init method, we have to do this. So now I'm creating an instance of the component usage. Then I have to use a method in the used component. The method name is get model. This one. Okay. So now I have a reference to that class, the class I've just shown you, SALVWD config table. So we have a reference of that class here. Now I can access all the methods that are available there. Okay, so what we will do in this tutorial is we'll add an input field with label year, and we will add a button. So if I enter the year and click search, then I'll see only the entries related to that particular year. That's what we're going to do. So we need to add an input field, we need to add a button. Now when we add an input field, in the usual way in the layout, so what we the mandatory thing that for adding an input element is we have to bind the input UI element to a context element, right? Right. So what are the things that we need to enter? We need to enter the ID, and also we have to enter the label, right? And also the value. So the value property should be binded to a context element in the view. Right. What I've done, I've already created one in the component controller. Uh, Probably I can create again and show you. Sorry, where is this? Okay. So I'm just deleting the existing development that I did. Um, so we'll do all this again. Okay, great. So as I said, for creating an input UI element, I need to have an attribute available in the context so that I can bind that to the value property of the UI element. So I'm going to create a node and attribute under that. Okay, so I think, yeah, it'll be here. Um, okay. Now, the important thing to notice here is, if you remember in the last tutorial, once we created ALV2 node to display the data in the ALV table, we did an external contextual mapping to the data node of the interface controller. In a similar way, for if you have any custom UI elements uh, that we're going to add for the ALV table, there is another node called function underscore element, right? So we have to do an external contextual mapping between the attributes that we're going to use for input UI elements to the function elements. So I'm just going to select this and say do mapping. Okay, it's now mapped. So that at the runtime, when system creates the input UI element on the ALV table, it will know which context attribute that it needs to bind, or it needs to read the value from. Okay, so that's why we're doing a contextual mapping, external contextual mapping between these two nodes. Okay, so I'm done with that, and I'll also map this to the view so that I can access that in the view. Okay, so all the mappings are done now. So let's create input element. Go to the init method again. Sorry, the code is gone, I think. Okay, we'll create the code again. First instantiate the used component. Select the component usage and select the get model method. Okay, so I have the reference to the configuration model of the ALV. I've already written the code, so I'll just copy the code and I'll explain the code here. Okay, okay, so we would like to add an input element to the toolbar. So what I've done here is SAP has given certain classes for each of the UI element when we want to add it to the ALV. If you remember in my I think uh, uh, dynamic UI element creation tutorial, um, we have class for each UI element. For example, for the button we have a class called CLWD button, and for the UI element you have CL underscore WD underscore input field or input element. But for the ALV, SAP has given a specific different classes. So if you go to the SC24, if you say CL underscore SALV underscore WD underscore FE, and hit F4. So you will see all these classes. For example, you have a class for drop down, you have a class for button choice, you have a class for button, you have a class for input field, you have a class for link to URL. So if you want to add, for example, link to URL, you have to use this class. If you want to add a button choice on the ALV toolbar, you can use CLWD button choice or the drop down, right? Now these classes are a bit different. There are other classes which we use when we do dynamic programming. They just start with CL, I think underscore WD, right? So these classes, um, hold on. Yeah. So there are two classes for button. This is CLWD button, and we have CL SALVWD FE button, which is specific for ALV tables. So for the input field, we have a specific class which is CLSALV WDFE input field. So I've created a data definition for that class, and what I'm doing here is so I'm basically calling the constructor of that class, and so it needs an input parameter, which is basically the name of the context element that we want to bind. And I've created a context element with the name year earlier, right, under this node, the year. So I'm passing that as an import parameter to the constructor. So what it will do, it will create instance. It will create an instance of this class with attaching this context element to the input field. And now there is a method called set label text, which will set the label for the corresponding input element, input UI element. So this is up to this. What we have done is we've just created an object, for input UI element, right? So now, but then we have not added this input UI element to the ALV yet. Now, to do that, um, the LV value, if you see here, it refers to the configuration class. So that class has a method called create function, right? It will take input parameters ID. You can give any name here, it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be input. You can give ABCD, no problem. Okay, so we need an ID to identify that function. That's it. So what I'm doing here is I'm using this method create function, and I'm creating a function, reference an object for that function. Now after that, how do I want to display that function on the toolbar? Right? I want to display that function as an input UI element, input field. So now for this object here, there's a method called set editor, and we need to pass the reference of the input UI element that we just created. So what happens is SCP understands that, okay, I have a function, and I have to display that function as an input UI element, because the set editor method uses a variable which is a reference to the input UI element class here, right? So that's how it works. Now if you want to add a button now, right, it's exactly similar code. If you see here, now what I'm doing here, I'm using this class which is specific to the button UI element. So I'm using create object. So I'm creating an instance of the button. Now I don't have any import parameters, because when you create a button, there are no mandatory parameters that you need to specify when you create a button in the usual way in the layout, right? So we don't have to pass anything here, but here we have passed context element, because we have to bind that. We have to do the binding of value property of the input UI element to one of the context attributes. So I've created a button instance here. Now then I have to add that button to the ALV table. Now this statement is exactly the same, except the ID is different because we need to differentiate between these two functions, right? So the ID should be different from here and here. So I said L button, and I'm using the same setEditor method here, and here I'm passing the reference to the button UI element. So system adds a button there. Simple. Let's activate this. Okay, bingo. So I have an input field with the label here, and I have a button UI element here. But I've not added any action handler, or I haven't created any action, for this button now. So we can do that. Go to the methods tab, and create an event handler. Let's say on click, and the type of the method is an event handler. So when I say event handler, that means it gets triggered when an event is raised by the system. So what is the event? Now to okay, I mean, I'll just define the event here, and then we'll see what it is. I'll select the component use. Okay, so now these events are not defined in this component. These events are coming from the standard component. So these are all interface events, right? If you want more details, you can refer my tutorial on how to trigger interface events from other components, right? So the event that is raised by the system when we click any of the functions that we define, any of the custom functions that we defined on the ALV, is on underscore function. So see, after call to self-defined application specific functions. So so what does it mean is when we click the button here, right, the system triggers this event in the standard component, and because I'm defining an event handler for this event, this method gets triggered. Now you can ask, what if I have multiple buttons here, right? So I have 3 buttons, let's say. If I click button 1, the same event gets triggered. If I click button 2, the same event gets triggered. So how do I handle, but I want to handle, let's say I want to handle a different, execute different kind of code when I click on button 1, different kind of code when I click on button 2. How do I do that? If you go to the on click button, so general action handler methods, generally they have only WD event parameter, but this particular action handler will have a parameter called r underscore param. If you go to the interface, if you go to the attribute, there's an attribute called ID. Now this ID, using that ID, we can differentiate which function is triggered, right? Now if I go back to the init method here, so where are we defining that ID? Is this one, right? So that's where the ID should be different for each function. Otherwise you cannot differentiate what user clicked on. So I can just say if r underscore param ID equal to L button sure if it is L button or yeah, good. So now I can write so if you have 2 3 buttons, so the button IDs will be different, right? You have to create buttons with different IDs, and then you can write a case statement or if statement to execute different kind of code when we click on different kind of button. So here what I will do is I will just populate the data based on based on the year that I enter here. So first I need to read the year. So we have a beautiful code wizard here, so I can just read the context element year. That's it of the code. And once I have the year value that I enter in the input field, I need to bind the ALV table, right? It's the same thing as we did in the first tutorial. Just this is a context node that we're binding the ALV table to. So I'm going to just bind that. So what I need to do, I need to fill this internal table here with some values. So I write a select statement in between these two piece of code blocks. So I say select star from the table called ymovie into corresponding fields of table ltlv2 where y year equal to lv underscore year. Sorry, that's it. Let's do syntax check. It's unknown. Okay, no problem. It just needs to be the top. Okay. Sorry, this is not a proper way of coding, but okay. So what I've done here is I'm just first reading the value that I enter in the input field here, and then I've written a select statement based on that year. I'm selecting some data from the table ymovie, and then once I have the data in this internal table, I'm binding that internal table to the ALVT node, and the ALV2 node is binded to the ALV table. So okay, activated. Let's just refresh this. Enter 2012 search. So the values which are related to 2012 year, I say 2011. Okay, so I have values only for 2011. So that's how you define a self-defined functions in the ALV table. Now if you want to add uh, let's say a link to URL or a button choice, or any of the UI element that you want to add, what you have to do is you just need to change in the code here the corresponding you know the corresponding SALV class that refers to the UI element that you want to add, and then just use the create an object of that class, and then in the set editor method just pass in that variable. Simple. If that particular UI element has an action associated with it, and then you create action handle like this for the function for the event on underscore function, and in the action handler use this r underscore parameter and the id attribute of that, and just write a case or if statement based on the id. You can write your own code. So that's it for this tutorials. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.